I'm Ebony Bennett, Deputy Director at the Australia Institute, and welcome to today's webinar. You wouldn't read about it, Fixing a Broken Media. I want to thank you all for joining us today. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that I live and work on Ngunnawal and Ngambri country and pay my respects to elders past and present. And I want to extend that welcome to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people joining us today on this webinar. Just a reminder that you can head on over to australiainstitute.org.au to sign up for future webinars. And a couple of quick Zoom tips before we get going. You can type in questions for our panelists today into the little Q&A box that we've got going. A reminder to please keep things civil and on topic in the chat, or we will boot you out. And lastly, a reminder that this discussion is live and it is being recorded. It will go up on the Australia Institute's YouTube page and website later this afternoon. But as you guys are already aware, the Australia Institute is really putting a renewed focus on its media reform research, and we're soon to be releasing new research about media concentration in Australia. Today, we're going to give you a little brief insight into what that research looks like, and we want to talk about some of the problems facing Australia's media today. I know many of you joining us today are supporters of the Australians for a Murdoch Royal Commission campaign. We want to welcome you to the Australia Institute. We're so excited to continue the work of media reform in this country with you. And we really do know that a strong democracy really needs a strong and diverse media with public interest journalism at its heart. We've done a lot of work in this space in previous years, and we're really excited to keep working on it with you all. So we do know that Australia's media ownership is amongst the most concentrated in the developed world, and it really gives private corporations and individuals like Rupert Murdoch excessive political and ideological influence. And some of our research that we're going to touch on today shows that some of those problems are only getting worse. So we're going to talk about some new research today. We'll talk about some of the recent research that we've released that looks at how the media plays a role in framing narratives and pushing certain agendas. And just for those of you who aren't familiar with the Australia Institute, we are one of the leading think tanks based here in Australia. We do public policy research that covers all kinds of issues, not just media reforms, but we look at economic policy, climate change, and ending fossil fuel expansion. We do a lot of work around strengthening our democratic institutions and integrity bodies and things like that. And we're delighted that you've joined us today. And I'm delighted to introduce our speakers today. Amy and Stephen, they're both acclaimed journalists. Amy Remeikis is Chief Political Analyst at the Australia Institute, one of the country's most respected political journalists, commentators and analysts, formerly of Guardian Australia, now hosting the Australia Institute's Federal Politics Live blog. Welcome, Amy.
Hi.
And Stephen Long is our Senior Fellow and Contributing Editor at the Australia Institute. He's winner of Walkley Awards, the Citigroup Award for Economic and Financial Journalism, and the Commonwealth Media Award. He was a senior reporter on ABC's flagship investigative journalism program, Four Corners, for many years. He's been a senior reporter and columnist at the Fin Review, as well as at the Sydney Morning Herald. Welcome, Stephen.
G'day. Hi.
I want to start off, I guess, with thinking about this current moment that we find ourselves in before we get to our research and talk about the current state of Australia's media. Amy, you recently left the press gallery, and we're now in the midst of a federal election campaign. How well is Australia's media serving the public right now, in your opinion?
It's a really difficult one to answer because I know that there are a lot of good people there doing the best job that they can. The issue isn't necessarily their job or how they're approaching it. The issue is that media at large is just not fit for purpose in this political moment, and probably hasn't been since, Trump emerged on the scene and we entered this post-truth world. because media exists with a certain structure. One is that journalists are entirely objective, which I don't agree with. I don't think that journalists are objective. I think they just, adopt centrist positions and make that the center and objectivity, and then basically both sides things around, the chosen center. I think also that media exists in this world where we consider everyone to be acting in good faith because of the position that you hold. So if you're, the opposition leader or a challenger or somebody who holds institutional power, therefore you must be respected because of the position that you hold, and therefore everything that you put forth must be in good faith. And I don't think that it is anymore, and hasn't been for a long time, but yet we present it as being in good faith. And you'll often find a lot of centrist media, and I'll use the New York Times as an example, basically trying to, explain how this actually isn't as crazy as you think it is, because there's no way that this could actually happen. And what Trump actually means here, no, Trump means what he's saying. He absolutely means what he's saying. It's the media that are trying to excuse and trying to put a veneer. I think they're calling it basically Trump washing, a veneer over what he's doing. And I just don't think that we're fit for purpose. We can't call a lie in Australia. There's many reasons for that, including our horrendous defamation laws, where you basically have to prove intent to lie, that they absolutely didn't know that this was the truth and were absolutely intending to lie. But also, we just don't believe that our politicians would lie, and therefore it would be, taking an unobjective position to say this person is lying. All of these elements are basically just adding up to Australian media following the rest of the world in treating this moment as a horse race, as something that is happening in a vacuum, completely separate to outside events. And I don't think that they're serving audiences. And we can see that as audience start to move to more, independent, outside of legacy media sources. And they're absolutely, I think, sick of the outsized cultural impact that the Murdoch press has on the Australian media in particular. When you look at the viewership and the readership numbers of the Murdoch press in Australia, it's not that high, but their cultural impact is huge because they set the tone for how everyone else follows it. And I think people are sick of that.
Yeah. Stephen, I want to come to you next. You were formerly at the ABC, and that obviously plays a huge role in public interest journalism, in providing local news. In a lot of ways, it's the backbone of the Australian media. How do you think the media is serving the public interest at the moment?
Well, in general, I'm in furious agreement with Amy. I think that there's an interesting drift we're seeing in the US where a lot of high-profile journalists are now exiting the mainstream and using sources online to try to reach audiences. In Australia, the dominance of the Murdoch media, and there's no pretense really. They are shills for the coalition. They are shills for the extractive industries, for the fossil fuel interests. They push Israel's line and view. They scream and bully anyone who disagrees with them. But critically, even though the actual numbers of people who read or view the Murdoch outlets is relatively small directly, as Amy alluded to, it influences the rest of the media. And I think it influences the ABC's political reporting because the ABC consciously or unconsciously has reporters who try to gravitate to the centre and represent all principal relevant viewpoints, as it's put in the editorial policy. And when you have a dominant media player that's skewing to the right, the Overton window, then the ABC's sense of where the centre lies shifts. There's a tension in the editorial policies at the ABC because it is required and its journalists are required to represent all principal relevant viewpoints over time in reporting. But what's often not understood and not practiced, it is by the best of journalists, is that that balance should follow the weight of evidence. And that's where we have a problem, because we now have politicians who will routinely lie. We have vested interests that will lie. And so you have a situation with much of the media and the ABC where a vested interest or a politician will come on an outright lie, and that will be platformed. And in an ideal world and in the best of circumstances, it's challenged. And I think that does often happen and is sometimes done well. But if you look at radio news or online, often it's not. Often, oh, we have to represent all principal relevant viewpoints. So we'll quote this person saying something that's absolute rubbish, demonstrably rubbish, absurd. And the thing is that a lot of people don't actually know that that's the case, that what's being said is absurd and wrong. So you get a serious problem. And in a post-truth world where you have the rise of fascism in the US, in parts of Europe, where you have politicians who are all authoritarian, and we have a sense that what they say should be reported, we're in trouble. And I think that that is one of the principal problems facing media practice today, that the old rules of media engagement don't work in this world, and yet those who challenge them are often accused of bias simply for telling the truth.
Yeah, and you could see that with climate, you know, when we were talking about climate within the media, we know what the science says, we know what the facts are, and yet just because you reported in certain elements of the media what the facts are, somebody had to go off and find some climate crackpot to say, actually, no, I don't think this is real, for balance. And that's not the job of the media. The media is to contextualize, explain the world to you, and tell you what the facts are, not to say, here are the facts, oh, but here's this guy we're legitimizing who is, you know, has a different view of the facts with their full opinions, and we're going to elevate these two things and say, they're the same, you decide. It's complete shit.
Yeah, and we saw the media has done that over a number of years on climate in a way that certainly at the beginning of the pandemic they absolutely refused to do on that crucial public health issue. Like, they weren't platforming anti-vaxxers in the same way that you would see fossil fuel companies platformed, or climate denialist platforms, certainly.
I think
Stephen?
I think on climate change itself, outside of the Murdoch press, that has shifted somewhat. I think the ABC no longer does that. But what it does do is, and other outlets, is uncritically report the gas industry saying, oh, we really need to expand more gas, and using more gas will mean less coal and be good for the world. We're actually a clean fuel, or a transition fuel.
Yeah,
and the uncritical reporting to give a point of view.
Stephen, I want to ask you about that, because I know we've recently released some research that touches on some of that. But first of all, I want to ask you about some upcoming research that we've got around media concentration. So we've taken a look at that. It's obviously, Australia is one of the most concentrated media markets in the world. What does our research show that we can share with people today?
So a sneak preview, we have a report coming out that looks at this, and we've looked at newspapers, and it shows a very, very high level of concentration and very little competition and diversity of content. So of Australia's 20 largest cities, 18 have no competition between newspaper outlets. We're talking the local paper, city paper, or metropolitan or regional paper for that area. 18 out of 20, no competition. 10 million Australians, nearly 40% of the population, live in a city where there's effectively only one local newspaper. Now, sure, there's a world of content on the internet, but if you want scrutiny on City Hall or the local government, you want a local paper. Also, there's been a terrible, terrible decline in the number of dedicated outlets doing that kind of journalism. So to take News Corp, for example, which is the dominant player in that city, regional, suburban media, less than 10 years ago, it had 200 dedicated titles, which either had a print newspaper in a locality or print and a website. Now it has 19. Now it still has other outlets that have a name, but most of them merely exist on social media or are a subsection of the local metropolitan daily. So you go, for example, to the Daily Telegraph and type in the Manly Daily, and you can get a pull-down menu of a few stories from the Manly Daily, which used to be a strong local presence in that area. And oftentimes the content is clearly generated by AI, or there might be one struggling journalist, and there's howlers like maps from an area, another state being there for the weather, or we've seen when we research this content that comes up where a headline or story should be, it's just got undefined. So this stuff is clearly being extremely poorly resourced. Australian community media, which was spun off out of Nine, Fairfax, a little while ago and taken over by the guy who ran the real estate website Domain, that has got a strong presence, but the number of titles is again dwindling because the advertising revenues are drying up. All of that revenue is being centralised on platforms controlled by, yes, Domain, but also Google, Meta, what have you. And so the revenue streams for this journalism is dying. We've also done some research, Ebony, that's looked at where journalists live. Now we're told in this election it's going to be decided in the outer suburban areas, the mortgage belts. And what we found is interesting. So on ABS data, there's 8,500 journalists or thereabouts in Australia. Nearly 60% of them live in inner metropolitan electorates. So that's more than live combined in outer metropolitan, provincial or rural electorates. On average, there's 108 journalists in an inner city electorate compared to 30 in an outer metropolitan. I mean, that's not surprising in a way because, of course, national newsrooms are mainly in inner urban areas. It doesn't necessarily mean they're all inner city leftists. I mean, we only have to read the content or view the content to put the light of that. But I think it does raise an important issue worth thinking about and debating. Some people might have grown up in the bush or in outer suburbs and still bring that perspective. But I know, having worked as a journalist, I spent, quite a long time living in an outer suburban electorate as a journalist. I now live in the inner city, but you do get a different point of view. You get a different outlook. I understood the whole support for Morrison because I was living amongst people who had that worldview. So I think it's interesting. I think it's interesting stuff, and we want to do a lot more of it.
Yeah, and don't forget, if you're joining us online today, if you've got questions for Stephen or Amy, you can pop those in the Q&A box that we've got. I can see one question there already, and we'll come to those kind of in the second half of this webinar. Amy, I want to come back to Trump in a little while, but I just kind of want to stick with the election coverage and the point Stephen was making there about, I guess, if journalism is in this kind of precarious spot where revenue is dwindling and we don't quite have the new business model yet. But people really are relying on journalists to kind of help them access factual information, things that are relevant to them and their concerns. And that's just becoming more and more difficult. How much does that influence things in a campaign, I guess, in the context of an election campaign where people are really trying to suss out where to put their vote, who's telling the truth on things, and that politicians, I guess, and the media care about the same issues that they care about?
Campaign journalism is such a broken model. Like it's an absolutely broken model, because what you do is you get a bunch of journalists, you stick them on a bus, You don't tell them where they're going. You don't give them any information. The only thing that they live, breathe, and hear about is the campaign and what is happening on that particular bus. They're basically deaf and blind to everything else that is happening outside of it, because you're on the move so frequently. You know, you're not having a lot of time to actually have contact or look up things. And so what that does is it means that you don't have time to prepare or research for, you know, these areas that you're going into. You don't have time to prepare or research into the announcements. You get a little bit of time to ask all your questions, but you've only just been given the announcement. Everyone is competing, asking about, you know, whatever else is happening in the world, trying to get their grab. Journalists know that the press conferences are broadcast now, and so you'll see a lot of journalists who are hungry to make their own name basically try to dominate through conflict journalism. Or, I mean, in the last few campaigns, we've seen absolutely rabid press packs where it's like screaming, particularly at Anthony Albanese and Bill Shorten in the 2019 and 2022 elections, absolutely screaming and losing their minds over things that weren't really relevant to what was happening outside of the campaign, essentially because like it just became like this absolute tribal rabble that was happening. And it doesn't actually inform people about anything. You're not actually learning anything about the policies. You're not learning about what is going on in the campaign. Then you've got journalists who are outside the campaign, and I give absolute credit to The Guardian for this. The Guardian got off the buses essentially a long time ago because they felt that the real information that people needed was outside of that campaign. All the press conferences are broadcast, so you don't necessarily need that, but going to talk to people in electorates. And that gave you know, all of us a much better idea as to what Stephen was talking about, as to how people were feeling. Like, I knew in 2019 that Bill Shorten was going to lose that election because I was in Townsville and nobody was open to listening to what Bill Shorten had to say. Everybody was like, no, I'm not for this. While the narrative in the media was that Bill Shorten has this in the bag. But when you were talking to people, you were like, oh, actually, no, he doesn't have this in the bag. And so that form of journalism is still very important. But I think more broadly, people feel like the questions that they want asked are not being asked, that people, journalists are framing questions in the most conflict or adversary way that they can. So we often see Peter Dutton says, or the coalition says, in terms of how we frame things, and get the leaders to respond to what a particular player is saying, rather than actually, you know, probe and investigate what is being said in the broad. And so you're seeing this really interesting thing, as Stephen alluded to, where people are turning against legacy media. Legacy media is not growing their audiences. They're shrinking. From the ABC to commercial media, they are absolutely shrinking. And so there's kind of like this bit of a death spiral where media doesn't actually know how to respond to that, or how to get people to come and look at them. Because people under 40, media has never actually played a role in their lives. They don't turn on the 6 p.m. news. They don't open newspapers. They don't even necessarily go to news websites. They get their media from social media. And you've seen a lot of content creators who have basically turned to being the journalist, to being the source of information. And for people under 35, they are the rapidly like fastest growing like form of news for people. And now you're seeing the media really freak out over the idea of influencers, you know, taking over the media space. And we've seen a lot of critical reporting about the fact that content creators and social media websites have been allowed to go into the budget, which is apparently only for journalists, to go on the campaign trail. Oh my God, Abby Chatfield is interviewing political leaders. The world is ending. When politicians are going there because that's where the audiences are, and the audiences are there because they feel that those people are actually representing their concerns, have the questions that they want answered, and are actually probing these issues from a position that they quite care about. And there's been a lot of criticism that, oh, you know, are we getting the critical interviews? Are we getting these objective interviews? I think most people now think that media is essentially biased, but they appreciate that the content creators that they follow on whatever side of politics that they land are at least open about what their own biases are. They don't pretend to hide them. They're basically saying from a position, here is who I am, this is what I believe in, you're following me because you believe in something similar, and I'm going to ask questions from this position. So media is really struggling to adapt to this new world. And so what they're doing is what social media companies try to do, which is just increase the conflict and try to get people to be a bit more angry. And they're having all of these sensational headlines and sensational points in order to try and get people to stay on their websites and argue with those points that they're seeing.
My favorite
Stephen,
moment, sorry.
You go.
Oh, my favourite moment during the last election was when a hapless reporter from the Financial Review got up at the press club and tried to deliver a gotcha question to the Greens leader, Adam Bandt, about what's the wage price index. And Adam Bandt turned around and said, Google it, mate, and pointed out how absurd those gotcha questions are, how they sidestep the real issues, power, policy. And, you know, this is one of the big problems that journalists are looking for those headlines rather than looking to inform.
Yeah, I guess I want to return to Trump for a little bit before we go to questions from the audience. And again, a reminder, if you've got a question for Amy or Stephen, pop it into the Q&A boxes there. If you spot a good question in the chat, you can also chuck it in there. But Stephen, before we get to Trump and the way the media is dealing with that, I did want to ask a little bit more specifically about the ABC, because I think the struggles that journalism are going through, public broadcasting is becoming even more important. And you've already talked about some of the issues within the ABC, but really we can only envision that the role of public broadcasting is going to become more important. And the ABC, despite having a lot of its issues, is still one of the most trusted. It's also right across Australia, which I think is probably important to why a lot of people trust it. It does provide a lot of the local news coverage that Australians across the country rely on. How do you see the future of the ABC and SBS and NITV, where the media really hasn't solved this new question of what the new revenue model is to fund journalism?
We are going to need publicly subsidised independent media, ABC, SBS, but also other media, I think, in this context. And we need something where that can be divorced from political pressure. We've already seen Peter Dutton come out and say he's going to cut funding to the ABC to address waste. Now, that's a pretty gross attempt during an election campaign to put political pressure on the ABC. So in that we've seen cuts to the BBC in England. However, they've had traditionally a licensing model for broadcasting, which has paid money and taken it out of the hands of politicians. We could look at things such as having a share of GDP that went to fund public broadcast, public media, something that basically meant that politicians who were being held to account weren't the ones deciding how much money this media got. But we are definitely going to need that. And I don't think it should just be the ABC. I think that there's a whole lot of interesting independent media that is going to scratch out a living at best, that should be able to get funding through grant programs and the like, because the revenue model is breaking down for mainstream commercial media. It's not coming back, and we need to look at new answers and new ways.
Yeah.
I think, I was just going to say, I think part of the issue, though, in terms of that revenue model, in terms of people wanting to defend the ABC, and I do believe that what people get angry about, as Alex Sloan has said in previous webinars with the Australia Institute, is that it's about 2% of what the ABC does. Like, it's the flagship, interview shows and those sort of things, the political interviews that people get angry about. But the ABC is so much more than just those flagship shows. It's absolutely vital to communities through local radio and covering those stories that nobody else does. The content it creates, like all of that, absolutely crucial. But I think in capitulating, as Stephen said earlier, to a lot of like the fear campaigns that the Murdoch press has run, that's been aptly aided by the coalition, that ABC estimates during Senate estimates is just basically coalition and right-wing senators just absolutely slamming and taking out of context the smallest things that ABC reporters have done, have basically cowed the ABC and other media outlets and actually standing up against this stuff. But then in being cowed, it's kind of feeding into that thing that the public doesn't feel the need to necessarily save it as much as they previously have, particularly during the Howard years. Because if we take the coverage of Gaza, for example, people are seeing what is happening in Gaza. They are seeing what Israel is doing in Gaza, but we are not seeing that reflected in our mainstream media. We're not seeing that reflected in the ABC. We're not seeing it reported on in even the same way and the same terminology that we see Ukraine and Russia being reported on. And this has properly impacted people's faith and trust in the media. And so while, yes, it is exceptionally important that we divorce funding from political influences, and there's a reason why we have statutory appointments in Australia, it's to basically ensure that institutions are strong enough to withstand political pressure because they can't be sacked. At the same time, like, we in the media have to respond to the public concerns that we are not actually reporting the world as they see it, because we have allowed vested interests to have influence over how we frame stories. And that is not what people expect. And the more you do that, the more trust you lose. And the moment you lose trust, then nobody actually cares what happens to you.
Yeah, and I think that kind of brings us back to Donald Trump. And Amy, before we came on, I sent you a tweet of a clip that I had seen on X of a US congressman kind of uncritically questioning, even invoking, shall we say, Joseph Goebbels as some kind of authority on how to do propaganda right and shape public opinion. And I guess I just wanted to, before we go to questions from the audience, I feel like Donald Trump really is exposing in a lot of ways a lot of the issues we've been talking about on this webinar.
Yeah, I mean, like, Donald Trump is the end point of everything that we've been talking about. There's been so much manufactured consent for what the Trump administration is doing by the both sidings, by the pretending that, that like these are all centrist policies, by ignoring the rise of the far right across Western democracies, by basically downplaying it, by taking, center-left policies or actual center policies and putting them up, and then putting up insane authoritarian policies and saying these are the same thing. By not actually probing any of this, we have created the situation in which Trump has been able to basically destroy what is left of American institutions, impose an authoritarian bordering on fascist regime, and we're going to see it get more and more fascist. And only a couple of months ago, media in Australia and in the world was having an argument about whether we could say Elon Musk was throwing up a Nazi salute. Like, we're still afraid to say Elon Musk threw up a Nazi salute. It was Nazi-like, it was an awkward gesture, it appeared to raise his hand in a way that was similar to what we saw in 1940s Germany. You just need to tell people what is happening. But Trump,
and what they can see with their own eyes.
But Trump has absolutely just taken this to the end point. He is going to continue to take this to the end point. And even today, with the batshit insane tariffs that he has applied to the entire world, we still are having people attempt to normalize what he is doing and pretend that there is some sort of sense or grand master plan in here, when we know from research and from history what this is going to do.
Yeah.
And we still refuse to actually just say to people, this is batshit insane, this is going to tank the American economy, and these are the implications it is going to have on the rest of the world.
Yeah.
I think it was a low moment for the ABC when on the 7 p.m. news in its bulletin, they referred to what Musk did as an awkward arm gesture. How the hell that happened, the ABC to be that cowed and that unwilling to call it for what it is, I think tells you that things are in a really, really bad way.
Yeah, and Stephen, sorry, you go.
I was going to say, just on the Trump example from today, media in Australia immediately started calling these reciprocal tariffs. Like the 10% tariff that is on Australia is a reciprocal tariff, which is Trump's language normalizing bullshit that Trump is doing. It's not a reciprocal tariff. Australia does not have these tariffs on American goods. There's nothing reciprocal about it, but we immediately take what he calls them and then echo it. And so before you know it, people are going, these are reciprocal tariffs. We must also be doing this. And this is how we undermine faith and trust in our institutions.
Stephen, you're a former investigative journalist. You've gone up against a lot of corporate power and vested interests in the past. Trump is kind of threatening to go after individual media outlets. He often characterizes the media as the enemy of the people for not just unquestionably parroting everything that he says. He's going after cutting off funding for various things as well. In Australia, in recent years, we've seen, the ABC raided and other investigative journalists raided. I mean, there's obviously also these kinds of threats that we have to be on the lookout for, not just in the United States, but in the Australian context as well, where we don't have the First Amendment and a right to free speech and other things that help aid journalism.
This is one of the difficulties when the media is making the mistakes and doing the poor job that it is to an extent. It's corrosive of public support for the media, and yet we need good journalism to hold democracy to account. We need investigative journalism, and we have a very low level of press freedom, media freedom in Australia. Journalists can be jailed and have been convicted for releasing things that should be in the public domain. And those things definitely need reform. But as Amy said before, we're in kind of a vicious cycle at the moment where the less the media is able to adequately confront power and the abuse of power, the less the media supports it. As the revenue declines and things fracture, one of the risks is that, and we're seeing this, people just give up on truth and go into echo chambers, which are telling them what they want to hear, and we end up in a diabolical situation. So we do need reform of a whole lot of things to do with media freedom, but to do that, the media has to earn the trust, because we will only get that through public pressure. Politicians and powerful interests, companies that pursue journalists like me through onerous defamation laws, they're not going to stop unless we have public pressure that says we need to reform the system to protect journalists. And no one's going to want to protect journalists unless we can change media practice.
I'm going to go to questions from the audience now, but again, if you're new to the Australia Institute, we have done a lot of past work around things that we've touched on today. So not only do we have more research coming in the pipeline, but we're deeply invested in really restoring trust in Australia's media, in fixing the ABC, and in really strengthening and making sure our media ecosystem is diverse and delivering in the public interest. We think it's critical to Australia's democracy and the health of it. And it's going to be one of the key ways that we make sure that Australia doesn't head down the same path as the United States. We've got lots of great questions in here. The first one I'm going to chuck to you, Stephen. Jennifer Bowen asks, how can the ABC restore trust?
So I think the leadership at the ABC is in a woeful state. And part of that comes from not just government pressure, but vested interests and that sort of drift to centrism. But part of it also comes from funding. One thing I was going to mention was when we had the coalition government cutting real funding to the ABC over a period of many years, you lost a large swathe of senior journalists. So just about all the senior journalists out of state newsrooms disappeared. And so, you know, it is that combination. We need a better funding model for public media to do its job, but we also need better leadership. And look, you know, I put my job on the line a few years ago when I was heading the Media Alliance, the Journalists Union's House Committee at Fairfax, and the then chairman tried to get journalists sacked because they'd been offending the government. And, you know, we held a mass meeting and called on him to stand aside whilst there was an independent investigation of his conduct. And he resigned the next day. And I was horrified to see the material that the last chairperson, Ida Buttrose, before the current one, sent about a journalist who is was a journalist who was doing their job in terms of Antoinette Lattouf, basically pressuring management in a completely inappropriate way to sack her, which happened. And so I don't know what the easy answers are. I would lapse into despair and ennui at times at the ABC. Especially doing that job of trying to hold the ABC to account as part of the Media Alliance internally, you know, it really got too much for me. But I do think, for all its faults, at its best, the ABC plays a critical role. And I mean, John Lyons has been a shining beacon at the ABC with what he's done. He's a very, very senior journalist, not afraid to speak more plainly and call things, and has the guts to actually take on his own management and the seniority to do that. And so, you know, we need to fix the ABC. We don't just need to save the ABC. It's broken. We need to fix it. But I do think it's important.
And I will say that the Australia Institute has done a bunch of research that you can find on our website around how we might go about and ways to fix the ABC that you guys can check out. And I'm sure there'll be more coming down the pipeline on that. Amy, I'm going to direct this next question from Sean Richardson to you. Sean says, one of the influences of the Murdoch or conservative media is that they take an issue and amplify it by repeating it through different channels so it gains momentum and is widely reported elsewhere. Sean wants to know, should independent journalism learn to use the same tactics?
I think independent journalism is using the same tactics. I mean, there is a wide berth across the political spectrum of fearless independent journalists who have basically made it their mission in life to, you know, like, excuse the profanity, but to fuck the Murdoch press and to basically treat them in the same way that the Murdoch press treats others within Australia. I mean, Hannah Ferguson from Cheek Media is a young woman who is doing it exceptionally well. She doesn't take any backward steps. Then you've got Michael West, who has been doing it for a very long time. You've had Crikey, who have basically, you know, muscled up to the Murdoch press several times, including being sued by Lachlan Murdoch and, you know, standing their ground and winning there. You've got Anthony Naomi Clan, who does the Claxton, I think it's called, who's also doing, very good work there. There are so many people who are already doing that. I think there is and it comes down to civility politics a little bit too in the media world, where these people and there's this idea that there's some of this is just performative, that the journalists who are, writing these stories, or the shock jocks who are on 2GB or on Sky or whatever, don't really feel this way. That's just what they do. And it's just like the role of the Murdoch press. And so therefore, you can fight the Murdoch press, but we shouldn't make it too personal and all of the rest of it. And I think that needs to change, because I think that there is no excuse for what the Murdoch press does when it goes after somebody in this day and age. We've seen it multiple times. It's usually people of color. It's usually migrants. It's usually people who don't have institutional power. And we will do hand-wringing articles of, oh, this is so bad, and what does our society come from, when we really should just be saying this needs to stop. This is bullying. This is using all of your cultural power to bully. And I mean, a great example of this is when we go to some of the protest laws that have been tightened up in response to the anti-Israel protests and the anti-genocide protests that we have seen in recent years, and what we've seen over the genocide, and what we've seen in terms of university crackdowns and the hate speech laws that are just, absolutely horrendous, and had both sides of parliament supporting them. The Murdoch press really basically just ramped this up and was saying that anti-Semitism is out of control, and that any question of Israel was anti-Semitism, and our politicians needed to react. I am not saying anti-Semitism is not an issue in this country. It obviously is, just as hate crimes against all different demographics and all different people of minorities and religions is also a massive crime. But there are moments in those campaigns where you would read the op-eds of the political journalists who were talking about things that were happening in New South Wales politics, where they would literally say, Shari Markson texted ex-minister at 7:34 a.m. with this story. It was the first they heard about it. So you actually have Murdoch journalists being activists in this space, being activists who are using and leveraging their communication and their relationships with elected officials to be all like, we need to act on this. But if that was to happen in any other organization, if it emerged that an ABC journalist, a Guardian journalist, whoever messaged the premier or a minister or the prime minister just being all like, we need to act on this, there would be outrage from the Murdoch press about activist journalists involving themselves in public affairs, and how this was a huge breach of ethics and the separation of powers. And yet we just accept that Ben Fordham or Alan Jones in a previous life, or whoever you want to name at the Murdoch press, are able to do these things, and that's just doing business. That's one of the things that I think Australian media really needs to start addressing and combating.
I completely agree. They're absolute bullies on the issue of Palestine and the war in Gaza. They have conflated anti-Semitism with any criticism of Israel, and done that in the most extremist way, and pressured and bullied and attacked anyone who held a different point of view. And one of the interesting phenomena is their audience is small and behind a paywall, and yet they do, as one of the people who put a question up raised, essentially clip it up, goes out on social media, amplified by shock jocks, and you see a phenomenon where a false claim or an outlandish claim will be made on Sky by one of their commentators on Sky After Dark, and this will get clipped up and go out, and then a sympathetic politician will make the same false claim in Parliament, and then that will then be amplified through repetition and reporting in the Murdoch press. So you get this absurd cycle that amplifies the disinformation and the bullshit. And yeah, it's really, really bad. So, I mean, some people like to say the influence has waned, and I don't think they will get up their poster boy in this election. We don't know, but they're cheerleading for Dutton, and it may not happen, but their influence, it can't just be not real. I often wonder why do the politicians run so much in fear? Why do even Labor politicians kowtow to the Murdoch press cap in hand in the way that they do? And, given that their audience is small, and then you look at the way it's amplified and the way it's run and and then people are getting some sort of message. They're not sure where it's come from, but there's a vibe, there's a message that's coming through. That's what the politicians fear. They're very good at it. And I would love to burn that house down.
I've got a question here from Gavin Miller that I think I will address, which is about the Australia Institute taking over from Australians for a Murdoch Royal Commission and asking what we're doing with that petition. Gavin, basically, Australians for a Murdoch Royal Commission have made the decision to close. I think there was an acknowledgement that there isn't going to be a Royal Commission, but there still is obviously a huge need for media reform in Australia. And so that has now closed, and the Australia Institute is taking forward this campaign. And that's why there's a lot of, I think, Australians for a Murdoch Royal Commission supporters who might be joining us today. The Australia Institute will be taking forward various bits of research that are looking at ways that we can fix some of the problems that we've identified in this discussion today, but also looking at wider issues that are affecting the media, and particularly ones that we think are undermining Australia's democracy and how we can address those.
Could
One
I
of those,
plug, Amy, for our recent gas shortage report, where we looked at the way the media covers claims of a gas shortage around the Australian energy market operators' annual pantomime, where there's a kind of Chicken Little, sky is falling, we're going to run out of gas, we're going to run out of gas.
yeah, and we've had a lot of media around gas in the last couple of days with Dutton's comments and things like that as well. But I will just finish up there and say we've got big plans in this space, and it builds on a lot of work the Australia Institute has already done, and I think our focus is bigger basically than the Murdoch media. We really need a strong fourth estate, and we'll be focusing in our research on lots of different ways that we can tackle that, whether it's misinformation and disinformation, looking at regulating big tech more effectively and its impact, supporting our public broadcasters, things like examining subsidies to make sure that people have access to quality local journalism. There's lots of things that we have looked at in the past and will continue to look at in the future. So welcome aboard. We're the Australia Institute. There's lots of information on us on our website. But Stephen, I will come back to you on that because gas really is in the headlines. Peter Dutton's kind of belled the cat that there is no gas shortage. We export most of our gas. But what did you find when we looked at how the media reports on basically what's an annual kind of report from an independent agency there?
Well, actually, that's one of the interesting questions. So the Australian Energy Market Operator puts out an annual report, which is called the Gas Statement of Opportunities. And each year it says, oh, we're facing a potential shortfall. Now, they're talking about extreme conditions in winter, extreme circumstances. And so far, the track record is they've overestimated demand for gas and also overestimated the likelihood of a shortfall, and it's never happened. So this is a real sky is falling event. And yet each year the media goes, oh my God, we could have a gas shortage, we could run out of gas. So we had a look at this, and we analysed every article that had been done, and we rated them on a scare scale in terms of the language they used, often hyperbolic, but scary terms like crisis, catastrophe. And you'll be surprised to know that News Corp publications held 6 of the top 10 places on the scare scale, and topped the podium with an article from the Adelaide Advertiser which quoted the head of the gas industry lobby saying that the imminent shortfall of gas was nothing less than a national crisis, and talked about the looming catastrophe. 2 days later, a report came back, and from a report in last year, they've actually pushed the time frame for a potential shortage back 6 years, which pretty much showed what we and a lot of independent analysts think, that this is all overblown. But it's interesting because the media would just go with the headlines and not contextualize it. Only a small number of outlets, the ABC and a couple of independent outlets and Crikey, put a critical gaze on these claims. The rest of the media went with the scary stuff. And so this is an area where we're hoping, even by highlighting this, that we can give a nudge to journalists, essentially by exposing the poor practice, for journalism to reform itself in the way it goes about this. And it's interesting as well that although the Murdoch press topped the podium, the Financial Review came in second spot with an article full of hyperbole about a gas shortage. And again, they give voice to powerful vested interests. No one looked at solutions. If you actually read the report, many of the solutions it was talking about included improving storage of gas, improving pipelines to shift gas from north to south, and things like demand response, where you created financial incentives for gas users to use less gas at peak times. That was rarely covered in the articles. It was all drill, baby, drill. We need more gas, more gas, more gas. Because the gas industry were the most powerful voices covered in the reporting. Climate change advocates, independent energy analysts and consumer groups and think tanks like us tended to be sidelined.
Yeah, and for people who don't know, the Australia Institute has done a huge amount of research into the gas industry, which all the time makes claims that we're facing a gas shortage, obviously because they want to open more gas fields. But 80% of Australia's gas is used for export. There's absolutely no gas shortage, something that Peter Dutton has just recently acknowledged. It's just that most of it is being exported overseas because they can get bigger profits for it. And as Stephen was saying, in any other time when you've got a shortage, there's all kinds of things that you do first, like trying to reduce your demand for things, some of those other elements that Stephen was talking about there. And yeah, I think this is one to watch in the future, but I think gas is certainly going to be prominent in this election campaign. I've got a question here from Suhaila Ali, and it is about race and systemic racism in the Australian media and how this impacts on reporting, acknowledging we're obviously all white people here on this webinar today, but that's not unusual in the Australian media either, Amy.
No, it's not. Most newsrooms are white, not just white, middle class, private school, educated. They all have the same networks. They've come up from all the same schools, all the same universities. As media has become more concentrated, getting into media basically is impossible unless you come from the right network and you have the independent wealth behind you to make it through those years where you're being paid absolutely nothing. And as Stephen pointed out in some of the research that they'll be releasing on the media, you're living in capital cities, some of the most expensive in the world. And the only way that you can afford to do that on journalist wages is if you are wealthy enough in the first place to even make it as a journalist. So it's class, a lack of class diversity as well as a lack of racial diversity. And it does impact our reporting because we see everything through the lenses of how we see the world. And if you have never seen the world from a diverse position, you're never actually going to see the gaps gaps in what is being presented in policy. You're not going to see the systemic racism within our police forces. You're not going to be able to see the disparity in education and health outcomes, because it doesn't happen to you. This is not your world. So when somebody says to you like, oh, I was, kicked out of a hospital and they didn't listen to me, the immediate response of a middle-class white person is, well, you must have done something wrong because that's never actually happened to me, without ever thinking, oh, maybe it's because I'm a middle-class white person, and so therefore I am treated differently. And so it absolutely has an impact. But the opposite, like the flip of that, is when you have companies, and the ABC has tried this, to address the lack of diversity by elevating diverse people from different backgrounds and different cultures to positions. They don't often put in the institutional support that they need in order to be successful. And so you're basically setting up people to fail, because it's not just a case of, look how many people we've hired. It's a case of, we've hired these people, we're going to give them the support, we're going to give them the training, we're going to give them everything that they need to be able to succeed in this role. And so eventually we're just going to become it's just going to become part of the mix. And you often see diverse people leaving newsrooms, including the ABC, because they do not have that support. So it's not just a case of hiring, it is a case of what are they doing to back these people in.
Couldn't agree more.
Thank you everyone today for your questions. I'm sorry we couldn't get to them all, but we do appreciate you tuning in today. We hope this has been a good introduction to some of the issues that the Australia Institute intends to cover. If you are coming to us from the Australians for a Murdoch Royal Commission, welcome. We're really excited to have you aboard this media reform project with us. And don't forget, during this election campaign, you can follow and join along with Amy on her live blog. Amy, do you want to tell us a little bit about that?
I'm basically live blogging every day of the campaign and Parliament and major parliamentary things like the budget, where you're going to get live coverage like you would be used to on a news website, but you're also going to get instant fact checks and analysis, because I now have access to an entire brains trust of researchers and economists and exceptionally smart people who are able to immediately just go, that's not true. And I'm also able to say, that's not true, when something is an absolute lie, and you'll also get a little bit of sass and snark. So if you have any questions about the campaign, send them through and we'll do our best to get them answered and fact checked for you.
And you can find that all at australiainstitute.org.au. Whenever the blog is live, there'll be a little flashing banner at the top of the website there to take you straight to it. And also just want to let you guys know that we've got a number of podcasts and other things where we examine policy in detail using Australia Institute experts and other experts as well. So you can find Follow the Money, the podcast that I host about economics, politics and policy. Dollars and Cents with Greg Jericho unpacks the Australian economy. And After America with Dr. Emma Shortis looks at, well, basically what the hell we're going to do about Donald Trump and the impact that that is having on Australia's relationship with the United States, as well as our other allies, how we position ourselves in the region and what that's doing to foreign policy. You can find all those where you normally find your podcasts. Thank you so much for tuning in today. We'll talk to you again soon, and take care out there. Hopefully we'll see you on a future webinar. Thanks, Stephen. Thanks, Amy. Thanks,
Bye.
everyone.
Thank you. Thanks, Ebony. Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye. Thanks for watching. We love that we can make these videos free to watch, but they're not free to make. It's thanks to our generous supporters that we can keep making research and content that changes minds. So, if you like what we do, please consider giving to the Australia Institute so we can keep doing it. Visit our website australiainstitute.org.au and click the donate button to see how your support can help fund high quality research that matters.